Hi, my name is Mark and welcome to The Active Listener, where we aim to listen, not just hear. We firmly believe that everyone has an interesting story to tell, if given the space to do so. So listening to what our guests have to say, you may learn something. So today I have a very interesting guest with the name of Ed Williams. Hello, Ed.
Hello, Mark. Nice to be here and thanks for asking me.
No problem. It's great to have you on board today because I know you've got a very interesting backstory. So we're going to kick off and with you telling us a little bit about yourself.
Okay, yeah. So I'm 54 and I'm married with two teenage children, adopted children, in fact. I live in Twickenham, grew up in Clapham, so not living far from where I grew up. And I think probably compared to a lot of my friends and other people I know, I've had a very varied and unconventional working life. Perhaps that's the thread that goes through our conversation today. I think just really, the decisions to do certain jobs at certain times and why I came to those decisions, I think, have been unusual compared to many people. I'm actually at a time in my life at the moment where I've just left the last job I was doing and thinking about the next thing, which is again quite unusual in your mid-50s. There's plenty to talk about there. I'm lucky to have a very stable and happy home life. My wife and I share a very keen interest in food and cooking, which has been a big theme for both of us. She grew up in restaurants and her father was a chef. So she, from a very young age, was surrounded by that world. For me, it came a bit later, but then I was a chef for many years and I owned a restaurant. So our whole life together and then our life with the children is very much, has always got cooking and the preparation of food and the enjoyment of food running in the background. And we're always having those conversations, not just about what we've just eaten or what we're going to eat later on, but also those sort of talks about the place of food in our society. And I think that is something that's changed a lot during my adult life from a social point of view, obviously from a health point of view, a socioeconomic point of view. It's a fascinating subject, what we eat and how we eat, and it's something we all have in common, but everyone's got an opinion. It's turned out in my career that I've ended up being involved with preparing food for people and observing people's behaviors around food, and then being involved in the health side of that. So I've had a really good opportunity to explore that side of our lives and our society. So more of that to come.
That's very interesting, what you're sharing about food and approaches and sort of attitudes to that. And it's such an integral part of your life, both previously and in fact in more recent times. I understand that you are a trained dietitian. So
that's right.
What led you to that as a career?
First of all, I'd say that I'm a very unusual dietitian. Most dietitians are women, probably 19 out of 20. And most of them a bit younger than me. So to meet a male dietitian in his 50s is quite rare. And this has come about because it's the latest step in a long career of one thing leading to another. And the cooking was all part of this. I think it's worth saying to begin with that all of my career decisions going back over 30 years have been very much influenced by watching my father, who grew up in a very different time, came from a family, a very high achieving family who had certain expectations. He was pressured into going into the law, which he never really enjoyed. And he did very well as a lawyer, provided very well for us as a family and was a good father, but he was very, very unhappy at work and didn't get the fulfillment and satisfaction that perhaps all of us expect to get from work or hope to get nowadays. And it impacted on his mental health, and he died shortly after retiring. And that, seeing that, particularly in my teenage years, when I was able to understand it, impacted quite profoundly on my own ideas for what I was going to do. And I think very early on, I knew that I only wanted to do the kind of work that interested me, naively and optimistically. And at that time, I just thought, I'll do what I enjoy, I'll worry about the money another time. I think possibly your perspectives change as you get into your middle years, but that certainly wasn't my motivation in those days. So I went to university, just studied my favorite subject, which was English Lit. So I did that, didn't work very hard, got some sort of degree, left university, and then became a painter and decorator for a few years because I was very keen on rowing at the time. Still am, and I just want to do as much rowing as I can, so I'll do a job that fits around that. Then I sort of started to become interested in cooking and food, and just began to think, all right, what really am I going to do for a living that's a bit more substantial and has a bit more direction and future in it? I found out about a year's cookery course, the Prue-Leith cookery course. So started saving up money to do that, ended up going there for a year, and that's where my whole cooking career began. And I worked in restaurants, and sooner or later got round to opening my own shop. So I had a kind of cafe, deli, sandwich bar, built up a catering business. So I did that for about 10 years, which was quite a success and very popular, and a good, a really good substantial chapter in my working life. But then there was another kind of turning point when my wife and I adopted the kids. She took a couple of years off work. I was still running the business, and then she went back to her job, and she's very successful in what she does. So it just sort of made sense at that time for me to sell up and spend some time at home with the kids. I got a good offer for my business, and I was ready to do something different. So I thought, yeah, let's just take some time, look after the children, and reassess. And during that time, I thought of all sorts of stuff. And it really came down to being a plumber or a dietitian. I didn't even know what a dietitian was in those days. In fact, the word dietitian in itself was, I thought experts in food were called nutritionists, and a lot of people, and they are. In fact, there's quite a distinction there. Worth throwing in at this point to answer my own question. A nutritionist is not a protected title, so anybody could call themselves a nutritionist. Somebody who just bought a book on nutrition, decided to offer out their expertise or write articles, all the way up to somebody who's done a 3-year university degree and is highly qualified, but the title is not protected. Right. A dietitian is a legally protected title, very much like a chartered accountant or a radiologist or a doctor, and you have to do a 4-year accredited degree, and it's defined as somebody that uses nutritional science to treat disease. So most dietitians, huge majority, you'll find in healthcare, which in this country means working in the NHS. So that's what a dietitian is. And that was the first thing that interested me, because to begin with, I just thought, well, I like the idea of being an expert on food and health. And I don't know, what I'll be doing. Maybe I'll be sitting in a clinic room telling people how to eat better, how to lose weight. Maybe I'll be working in a hospital on a ward. I don't know, but that's how the whole thing started. I think there was another side of it for me as well, that I'd done pretty well at school. But then as soon as I got to university doing my English degree, my interest in academic achievement kind of evaporated. I was distracted by all the usual joys of university life. And I just about muddled through with a degree. But I'd always sort of had this sense that I hadn't quite done justice to my brains and my academic abilities. In fact, having an opportunity in my 40s to go back to university and do a really challenging science degree, having not done any science since I was 15 or 16 as well, was really appealing. And I think that in itself drew me into it, because I think it was to prove to myself that I was capable of meeting that standard. And at that time, I just thought, well, I've done quite well with my businesses and I've achieved quite a lot here. So why wouldn't I do well if I apply myself in the same way? Funnily enough, studying to do something, any job, studying and training to do it is actually quite different to doing the job itself. If you look at undertaking training for any kind of professional skill, you're going on a journey from your first day when you know next to nothing, and you have your first lectures and your first assignments, and then you start to get an awareness of what the job will actually entail, and it moves more into a sort of practical sphere. For me, that meant, as after a couple of years, you start doing hospital placements, you begin to see patients, and so all of that theory starts to get put into practice. But even so, for me, it was 5 years of study, because I had to go and do a year before the degree, doing effectively all my science A levels with an access course. So you do that, and then you get the kind of thrill of meeting the standard and getting a place at a good university, which sort of feels like a little mini mountain climbed in itself. Then you do the degree, and you know that it's going to be 4 years, and you're being assessed, and you're doing all the essays, and you're constantly trying to get the highest marks and being maybe a bit competitive with the people you study with. So there's all these little staging posts and achievements that you tick off as you go along, culminating in getting the degree itself. For a lot of people, they were dead set on getting a first. I must say, a lot of people I studied with did. For me, getting a 2-1 was the pinnacle of my ambitions, and achieving that it gave me a huge sense of satisfaction, just given how hard it was. But it's still, the whole thing just felt like a big long-term project, start to finish, with this end point in sight of successfully qualifying, being able to have those letters RD, registered dietitian, after my name, and say, yes, I've achieved this against the background of family life and everything else, and with the other things I've done. And so getting over the finish line gave me a huge sense of satisfaction. However, once you've done that, then you start going out and looking for jobs. Now, turning up for work and actually then practicing and using what you've learned day in, day out in the real world, in a team of colleagues, with all the surrounding factors that make up a working life, that's completely different. For me, certainly, working in the NHS and all the other elements of what my working life ended up entailing ended up being quite different to how I expected. Mm-hmm. And the way I responded to it was quite different to what I expected.
It sounds like there was a certain level of competition or drive there to progress, the challenge, because from some of the things you made reference to in the past, you're up for doing something new, for learning. And it sounded like there was a bit of a challenge there in terms of what your expectations were regarding the course, and then the reality of actually doing the studying. And fair play to sort of effectively do your A levels again, and then to do a further 4 years. And that's, it's a big ask. Done that, you've got your 2-1, you're static. You're now facing working in the NHS, and it sounds like from what you're indicating that there's a bit of a culture shock, or it wasn't what you expected. So what was it you expected, and what was the reality?
I think to begin with, I would say, before I embarked on this journey, because I'd essentially always been self-employed and had control over the terms of my day-to-day work, I'd been fairly successful, but I'd also been able to decide what being successful meant. So I would choose my projects and choose which direction to take my business in. Everything made sense to me. I wasn't being told what kind of work to do by anybody else. So that probably made it easier to succeed on my own terms. When you are in one of the world's biggest organizations, a very hierarchical, rigidly managed organization, the NHS, and you're very junior, you come up against a very different way of working. Mm-hmm. And I think my my expectation, my naive expectation was that I would progress pretty quickly through it. I did a lot of work experience in the hospital. I ended up working at the start of my degree. I thought I should, just to get a feel of it, go on the wards, and they were very helpful. I spent weeks there actually helping out on projects, just getting a feel for it. And I came out thinking, yeah, I can really see myself working in this environment. And I looked at some of the people there and I thought, yeah, I could, I'll be here a couple of years and I'll move up into this job and that job. Before I know it, I'll be in management. It all made sense to me. Didn't really work out like that, I think. And the reality of being a very junior member of the team, but also 25, 30 years older than my colleagues, 25 years older than my manager, the only man, all of those things gave me a sense of not really fitting in. That's certainly not down to any of the people I work with. They were lovely and very, very welcoming and accommodating and generous with their knowledge. But I think the way you perceive yourself and the way you feel about how you fit into your surroundings has a big impact on your confidence and your belief, just down to believing the words that come out of your mouth. I think a lot of us can just put on our best face and get through it. But if you've got this kind of fundamental underlying doubt about being in the right, whether you're in the right place and whether other people take you seriously, that can be quite corrosive to your confidence and motivation. Anyway, managed to get a job at St. Peter's Hospital. Coincidentally, or not, was the hospital where I'd done all this volunteering and everything. But I applied for a couple of things. A job came up there. Again, the whole interview process in the NHS is pretty rigid and transparent. But I felt great about going to work there because I'd met a few people before. Went straight into a typical Band 5 role, which is Band 5 is a newly qualified dietitian, where you have a couple of wards to take care of, and then you do a weekly outpatient clinic. So on the wards, I had a respiratory ward and a cardiac ward, so I was looking after the nutritional needs of acutely ill people, some of whom may have not been eating enough or not been able to eat because of the acute illnesses they had. Some of them would perhaps have to be fed through tubes because they weren't able to eat orally at that stage of their illness. So you're working in a pretty fast-paced environment. Hospital wards are very busy places. There are nurses, doctors, physiotherapists, all sorts of people competing for space and the access to the medical notes. It's obviously very hierarchical and everyone defers to the doctors and the junior doctors defer to the senior doctors. So that takes quite a bit of getting used to accept. And as a therapist, as a dietitian is what's known as an AHP, an associated health professional. So although hopefully you are respected and your advice is acknowledged by doctors and everybody else, you're definitely a junior person in the pecking order. And so there's a lot of standing around waiting until everyone else is finished until you make your comment, and then a lot of the time your advice may not be heeded, or maybe people may just ride roughshod over what you've said. That side of it, you do feel like you're part of the busy professional hospital team, and sometimes that your input is really having a good impact on outcomes for people. The other side of the job I mentioned, the outpatient clinics, it's a bit like a GP in surgery. People who've sometimes waited 3 or even 6 months to see a dietitian, they've got about half an hour with you, and they could be there for anything from newly diagnosed diabetes to irritable bowel syndrome, weight management, people for coming in for advice about being overweight, advice about being underweight. They could have all sorts of digestive issues, all kinds of things, really. You get a little bit of time before a clinic, just quickly looking at people's notes, so you've got some idea what you're looking at. And that is a very, very rewarding side of the job, actually. And that's probably the thing that was closest to how I'd imagined it. Because very often the problems that people have when they come in to see you have impacted hugely on their quality of life. Perhaps you have somebody in their 40s who's just been diagnosed with type 2 diabetes. Could be any number of reasons. Perhaps their weight's crept up on them over the last couple of decades and they've been warned to lose a bit of weight and haven't been able to. And then they've had a blood test and found that they've got to go on medication because their blood sugars aren't well regulated enough. And then perhaps they've had another warning saying that if you don't change your diet or if you don't lose some weight, then we're going to start insulin. Those are real turning points in people's lives. And sometimes the advice that people are able to get from their GP or elsewhere just doesn't go far enough or deep enough or give people the right motivation, and they don't feel sufficiently supported to really make those changes. So in situations like that, you really feel you've got an opportunity to make an impact and to help somebody make life-changing decisions with your support. Irritable bowel syndrome is another one, something that people often feel uncomfortable or embarrassed or uneasy to discuss, but it can be hugely debilitating when people have really crippling digestive problems, not always caused by their choices of food. There's a big link with mental health and anxiety, but it gets to the stage for some people where they are, it's a vicious circle. Sometimes the anxiety can exacerbate digestive and bowel symptoms to the point where people are worried to leave the house because they need to be near a toilet at all times of day. And then that creates a whole new level of anxiety in itself. And people try to find links between certain foods that they're having, and they think, well, maybe it's this. Often a lot of superstition is then involved that is not very logical or evidence-based. But then when you sit down and start taking a diet history and trying to unpick what the triggers are for the symptoms somebody's experiencing, even if there isn't any evidence for what they say, you still are wise to take it seriously, because your symptoms are your symptoms, whether there's research to back it up on a wider scale. It's real to that person and their distress and their lifestyle, and everything that they're struggling with is very real. But it can be hugely challenging, and often, the kind of conversations you're having end up not having much to do with food or physiology or anything very scientific. People often just want to feel listened to and want to feel heard, and that's how it all begins. It's funny, really. You can think one week you're in university doing these things on a theoretical level and you have a bit of hospital experience, but then you go out and get a job, and the first few weeks you sometimes can't quite believe, now you've got letters after your name, you're just being let loose, giving advice unsupervised to patients and being regarded as an authority on all things to do with diet. So that does take quite a bit of getting used to, but it's quite a thrill as well, actually, when you have a successful encounter with a patient and you feel you've made a difference and you think, yeah, this is why I did it.
You really wanted to make a difference. You're having an impact, both in terms of what people are eating, but also from a well-being perspective, from a mental health perspective in many ways. You spoke there about like fitting in or being different to everyone else, whether it be in age or gender. and also that kind of feeling of not only getting used to being sort of lower down in the pecking order, but also the responsibility, and now you're being respected or let loose, as you said, to make these decisions and so on. It seems like alongside that, there's this element of uncertainty, like an imposter syndrome.
Absolutely, and I don't think I ever got over that. And it's funny, I never felt that at all in the other types of work I did before. So it was quite a surprise to me that I felt like an imposter as a dietitian. And I'm still not quite sure why that is, really, because I think it's natural to feel that way in the beginning. Even after a few years of doing it, I still had this sense that probably other people were better qualified than me, and possibly this patient would do better getting advice from another colleague, from a senior colleague. Whether that's got to do with how I was managed, I don't know. I think I was involved with different people in the job I had, but one of whom was very kind of relaxed and would just say, just go out there, don't worry, it'll be fine, say what you've got to say. And she was a very senior member of the team and just seemed to be quite sort of trusting and open and all about building confidence in the people she was managing. The colleague I had who managed me most closely over most of the time I was there, though, was quite a bit younger, very, very high achieving and good at what she did. But I always sort of had this sense that she was looking over my shoulder and commenting in a slight more of a sort of deficit based way. Always had this sort of feeling that we'd have these reviews every now and again saying, well, I was looking at these such and such notes that you wrote, and are you sure you wanted to write this? When you feel that everything you've done is being sort of double checked, and it makes you quite nervous, and I don't know, it's like a lot of things in life, you just tighten up and you can't quite relax and be yourself. So that definitely sort of impacted on my ability to be myself. In healthcare, it is very, very important to be supervised all the way through your career, not just when you're newly qualified, but even when you're very senior. It's important to have mentoring and ongoing clinical supervision from, even when you're at the very top, just to talk through patients with other qualified people just as a reference point, and to make sure that you're not missing something really important, and to give you some perspective. But I think if we use the analogy of sports coaching, everybody has different ways of expressing themselves and giving their best. And I think a skillful coach will take time to find out what motivates that person and what conditions they need to work in to give their best. Because if you've successfully completed a very challenging degree, say, and then successfully interviewed for a job, all of that says that you've got certain qualities and abilities that have brought you to that point. And from a manager's point of view, it's then part of your challenge to find how to enable that person to express their best abilities in that job. But it's going to be different for every single person, I think. And what I've really found in this is that confidence is such a key part of it. We often think of that in a sporting context, reading the football reports. Maybe there's a really highly paid player who's moved to a new club and just isn't performing and isn't scoring goals. And everyone's saying, why haven't they scored yet? It's been 2 months since this player scored a goal. And then the scrutiny becomes unbearable sometimes, the weight of expectation. And sometimes I think in different ways in our lives, that kind of pressure, whether it's self-imposed or imposed by others, can start to really weigh down on you. And it becomes so present in your thinking that it distracts you from the very simple business of doing your job. I think that did happen to me to some extent in my work.
And is that one of the things that led you to move on from your dietitian work?
That's one of the things. Also, the fact that I just didn't really feel that I fitted in. Something you hear a lot about nowadays is people talk about finding your tribe, don't they? Have you heard people say that? You know, sometimes it's talking about things you do outside work and how it's important to have this sense of belonging to something. And you know, outside work, for me, my tribe is definitely my rowing and the people that I row with. That's a world where I feel comfortable with, where we all want to do the same thing. We all kind of accept one another and feel that we've got the same outlook and the same interests. And I certainly felt that the team of people I worked with at the hospital, probably 25 or 30 dietitians, who were all very, very nice people and very accepting and welcoming to me, most of them gave the impression of being a tribe together in terms of the work and also the things they did outside work. A lot of them would share houses and know each other socially and be part of a wider tribe of dietitians where they had a kind of deep underlying base of interest in the world of dietetics and everything that surrounds it. So it all made sense for them being in this world. And I always, in my mind, even though I tried to throw myself into it and sort of attend talks and be part of stuff, I always felt like a visitor. It's funny, I think around in your 40s, that's the time when a lot of people start to think, you know, have I made the right career choice? Why am I doing this? You know, I'm only doing it for the money. I can't leave because I'm the breadwinner, and I wish I'd done something else. You know, I've got a great friend who's a very successful solicitor, achieved a lot in that work and provides really well for his family and has a lovely house. But he's said many times over the years that, you know, he wishes he could just be a carpenter, a cabinet maker, something he's also very good at. But clearly their lifestyle would have been a bit different had he chosen to do that. And he hasn't. He's, you know, it's not a choice that he's got. So it's something that he can pursue in his free time. He's not the only one. Lots of people have thought, oh, you know, I wish I could just you know, take off the burden and do something all day that really that I really feel excited about. Well, I'm quite unusual in that I've had loads of opportunities throughout my working life to change what I do. I've pretty much changed jobs whenever I felt like it. I'm very fortunate that my wife's successful in what she does, is just immensely supportive and understanding, and never, I mean, she'll question it in terms of whether it's right for me and what makes me happy, but she'd never say, oh, don't leave that job because it won't be right for us. She just wants me to be happy in what I do, which is an amazingly privileged position to be in. Possibly it's made it too easy to change doing things. And I think back to what I was doing in my 40s with my catering business and my shop, you know, which was a great success, really. It wasn't enjoyable the whole time, like anything, but if I'd had no alternative, I would have carried on doing that. I don't know what I might have been doing now. In fact, I was in this hugely privileged position to go to university in my 40s and start all over again. All my university fees were paid for by the NHS. They were so keen to get good people into dietetics. They've stopped that now. But for about 10 years, if you could get a place, so there were about 350 people applying for 25 places at KCL, which is where I did my degree, which again made me feel pretty good about getting one of those places. And then they pay your fees. So the whole thing, it was a great opportunity. But around the time I did that, a lot of my friends were just all feeling quite disenchanted and thinking, oh, you know, I wish I could do this career. I wish I could stop this sort of humdrum life, but it's too late now. I'm just speculating and thinking, well, we often look at other people and think, well, what he's doing must be more interesting. Or, oh, you know, she always seems to be very self-determining in her life and do what she wants. I wish I could be a bit more like that. But satisfaction in life comes in many shapes and forms, and work is just one part of it, isn't it? You always hear about the people who threw in a high-flying city career and then, gave it all up, sold their house, moved to the country to become a shoemaker, living in relative poverty, but who say, I never regretted it, I'm much happier 15 years on, or who actually become a really successful shoemaker and really critically acclaimed. And these are the ones you read about. You don't ever hear about the people that stopped doing a certain career, invested loads of time and effort in doing something else, and then had second thoughts about it many years later. And I think I wouldn't say that what I've done has been, that I regret it. It's certainly not been a complete success for me. And that has surprised me, despite having really committed to it, and despite the fact that I've inevitably developed a really deep insight into food and nutrition and behaviour and the way that affects society. I've had fascinating conversations with all sorts of people, with colleagues, with patients, obviously with my wife and with my friends, all about how food and our eating habits and behaviours and government policy on food production and the way on global policy on food production, how all of this has brought us to where we are now. There's a big disconnect between the big picture and looking at the last few decades in hindsight and saying some of these decisions about agriculture and food production weren't such a good idea in hindsight. There's a big disconnect between that and then being a practitioner sitting across the table from one patient who you can see obesity is what I'm thinking of in the background, because when we were children, obesity wasn't really an issue you heard about. Now it's a huge challenge to individuals and to society, and as a result to the economy, because of all the healthcare costs involved. And it's largely come about because of post-war agricultural policy, trying to feed everybody with the best intentions, but inevitably that led to massive production of cheap, high carbohydrate foods, grains, flour, and industrialized food production made a lot of people very rich and has created a world where people eat these very highly processed, high calorie, but affordable foods. And this has led to a world where people on average consume far too much energy. And it's created a huge health crisis that nobody really seems to know how to get out of. Knowing all that in the background, certainly as a practitioner, you quickly get over any prejudices towards people who might be struggling with overweight. The common perception might be, well, they got themselves into this position, they shouldn't eat as much. Well, when you realise the scale of the problem, you realise it's just people are living in completely hostile conditions where it's inevitable, human nature being what it is, that a huge percentage of people are going to end up overweight. And then as a dietitian or as a doctor or as a nurse or anybody that's treating people who are struggling with it, you're trying to support somebody with changing their situation, making realistic changes that can actually help them lose weight and be healthier, but in a hugely hostile environment where they're beset with food choices and availability of foods and social conditions that completely oppose what they're trying to achieve. That's a really interesting one, and everybody knows about it.
You're very passionate about this area. You know the sort of the history, the backstory, which has helped the way that you interacted with your clients or your patients. So now you're at this kind of crossroads with having left the NHS, but still clearly interested in food in general and understanding the importance that has from many perspectives. What does that mean to you now? Is it something that you see yourself remaining in as a field, or is it like, oh, I'm going to do something completely different again?
That's the question that I am wrestling with at the moment. On the one hand, I have successfully started again and done different things several times before in my life. So there's no reason I shouldn't do that now. On the other hand, I do have a certain amount of knowledge and experience now as a dietitian, so I've probably got something to offer people. But I'm just looking at the channels in which you can do that and wondering if that really suits my personality. You know, in the course of thinking about this conversation, I looked at what my working life had involved. A lot of the work that I've done and found most satisfying has involved undertaking a series of little projects, seeing them through to completion. So I think of my early career as a decorator and doing building work where you might decorate a room or fit a kitchen or paint the outside of somebody's house, build a wardrobe. You have a kind of you have a problem, and then you have the inception, meeting the challenge, seeing it through, doing everything meticulously, and then completing it to everybody's satisfaction. It's complex enough to be rewarding in that way. Catering was the same. I catered for weddings for many years. All of those, you know, the process begins probably 6 months before, and then it gets to the sharp end in the week before the wedding, and you've got ingredients, hiring staff, making sure the whole thing goes well on the day. It all goes off well. Everybody loves the food. The event's a success, and then you do the next one. So on, you know, with the catering and the business and the shop that I had, you get quite a satisfying cycle of challenge, most times success, reward, and then it's repeated in a way that feels good. I think with the training as a dietitian, as I've described, actually taking on the challenge of the study and becoming qualified felt like it had that same shape. You can just look like you're climbing the mountain. You get to the top of the mountain and think, well, where do I go now? The process of being a dietitian is, you know, the job satisfaction available to you really comes in very, very little pieces. I see a few patients in a day. Many of the patients that I was presented with were, unfortunately, there wasn't much opportunity for satisfaction and fulfillment from my point of view, often because there wasn't really the opportunity to have enough impact. The sort of patients I was seeing were often underweight or malnourished, older people who were, you know, often in many cases approaching end of life. So there was very little scope really to have a big impact. You try and make the best contribution you can in many cases, but the ratio of patient contact to administration seems completely out of proportion as well. You know, you might spend 5 or 10 minutes with a patient and then an hour or two doing all the processing around it, and then a few weeks later you'll find out it hasn't really affected the outcome. So I found that was less satisfying than I was hoping it would be. And then outside the NHS world, I think the option is really to be an independent practitioner, seeing private clients where hopefully you would meet people where you feel you've got more of a chance to make an impact. But I'm just wondering whether my personality is the right, you know, if I'm the right kind of person to be doing that sort of work, because I just want to have that sense of believing in what I'm doing. And I think knowing what the problem is and understanding the backgrounds and being able to speak passionately in that way might not translate into being a passionate practitioner doing it on an everyday basis when you don't know what kind of patients you're going to encounter.
Yes, and I'd be interested to know more, and perhaps we can hook up at a later stage to see the progression you've made, because I'm certain that you will find something else to do, and you've got that kind of chutzpah to keep going. And I think ultimately there are points where you just have to know this isn't for me, but I've given it a go. And that's what you've done. And I'm sure regardless of whether you go back to dietitian work or not, there are key things that you've learned from that process, which you can take forward, whatever it may be?
Yeah, I think it's inevitable that working in the sharp end of healthcare, I've worked through the pandemic and visited people at home in my community role who were living in very, very difficult circumstances. So you really see the big cross section of society. It challenges your own preconceptions and shakes you out of, what in my case is a very comfortable and privileged environment that I live in. And you realize that many people have just been very unfortunate throughout all of their lives, and this impacts massively on their health. Yeah, healthcare is a very interesting thing. I think everybody knows that the NHS is struggling, failing in many cases to meet the demands that are placed on it. Those demands have changed massively over the last 70, 80 years since it was founded. And what struck me is that the whole system runs on goodwill, really. There's a completely unrealistic expectation. A lot of people are hugely grateful for the help they get from the NHS, but a lot of people have unrealistic expectations and a sense of entitlement that the NHS should do everything for them. And I remember years ago, long before I became a dietitian, a friend who's a GP talked about what she called the medicalisation of everyday life. Now that there's an NHS, people, not just members of the public, but members of the medical profession, try and introduce medical solutions and medical input for things that really should be a matter of day-to-day common sense. And not only does this mean that many people are reluctant to take responsibility for their own well-being, and they don't know how to, because, but the NHS actively encourages people to defer responsibility for their own health to GPs and healthcare programs. And so it takes the thinking out of it, and people feel that there will always be a medical or a pharmaceutical solution for everything. Now, the extension of that is that as medicine develops and as healthcare becomes intertwined with every bit of our lives, there's this idea that there's no ailment that can't be either cured or addressed or mitigated by medical input. And there's a fantastic book I'd really recommend by an American doctor called Atul Gawande, called Being Mortal. And he's a hugely experienced doctor who has worked in healthcare and seen thousands of patients in his working life. And his observation is that the whole of modern healthcare has developed to prolong life at all costs, with an emphasis on treating people because you can, when perhaps the emphasis should be on quality of life and not length of life. Both practitioners and patients are sometimes sharing in a process where everybody thinks, well, this solution exists, there's a 10% chance of it being successful, but because it can be done, it should be done. The kind of value attached to prolonging life has come to outweigh value attached to having a shorter life, but with less suffering, and where people are allowed to focus on the things that are really important. So instead of having more days and more years of life, there should be a focus on how you can enhance your experience of the time that you do live. That was very, very thought-provoking to me. And in a lot of the work that I did with people that were in their 80s and 90s and had been unwell, maybe bedbound for many years, maybe underweight for many years, one of the things we do as dietitians, people aren't eating, is prescribing these little bottled milkshakes, which are nutritionally complete supplements. If people won't eat anything else, we'll prescribe some of those. If you can't drink it, you might give it with a teaspoon if they can't take anything orally. Somebody, you know, as a last resort, may end up being fed through a tube for one reason or another. And sometimes you would look at the way in which people are living and thinking, why are we doing this? You know, how does this person benefit here? And sometimes nobody really knows. The family don't really know. The medical profession don't know. But it seems like there's no way out of it. Again, you can look at it from a distance and think this is madness. When it's you, or when it's somebody that's close to you, your whole attitude changes and your value system changes. It's interesting. As part of the wider debate about where the NHS is going, how we allocate our time and resources, there does possibly seem to be this emphasis on just keeping people staggering along when the quality of life is long gone. And that's something I encountered a lot in my last job, certainly.
That's a huge debate, and that's a topic for a series of podcasts. One of the things we do is the favourite 5. Can you share with me either an interesting fact about yourself or something that you're most proud of?
And something that I just look back on with a lot of pleasure. I'm not sure how interesting it is. Going back 20, 30 years, I was the singer in a covers band for a few years, on and off, with a bunch of blokes who I'm still friends with. And it just remains one of the most enjoyable things I've ever done. And I still daydream about doing it again. They were all great musicians, and I had no background at all. I was just an energetic frontman, and we did a few weddings and events and things. But just the joy of doing that and expressing yourself and seeing other people, getting an audience of a few hundred people dancing and cheering and begging for more was just the greatest thing. And I think, you know, when you talk about fulfillment and satisfaction in life, you can see why people who perform just want to do more of it. It was a great thing to do, and we loved it. So I look back on that with such affection. There's very little evidence of what we did, but very well ingrained evidence in our memories, I think, you know, and people that saw it. So it was fantastic.
Excellent. Well, it fits nicely into the next question. What would be your favourite song or piece of music?
I think that's a difficult one for anyone, isn't it? Really trying, and it could probably change from day to day. The song I would pick for me, and probably if you ask my wife, she'd say the same thing, is "Here Comes the Sun" by the Beatles.
George Harrison, yeah.
It's something I could play it now and just it would sound fresh and it would move me. It's got that lovely. It has a cheerful but slightly melancholy feel to it. I attempted to play guitar a bit, and I've been trying to play that, which is for many years has quite a fiddly kind of mechanical kind of approach that you need to picking it out properly. Not when George Harrison plays it. It's just wonderful. My children have grown up listening to that song, just hugely meaningful to me. That's the song I'd have played at my funeral, I think.
Oh, thank you. So, Food.
I'd have to say Italian, I would say. My wife is from Italian family. A lot of the food that we cook and eat together and that we've enjoyed together is Italian. But I think having worked as a chef and worked in cooking for so long, a lot of my training was in more of a sort of French tradition with a lot of complex sauces and quite elaborate dishes with a lot of different elements. And I think the more you cook and the more you eat, the more you just want to eat simple, uncomplicated, high quality food where the ingredients are wonderful, and that doesn't mean that it doesn't require a huge amount of skill to prepare it, because actually bringing the best out of simple ingredients, say a beautiful piece of fish, some lovely vegetables, just preparing those perfectly. You imagine if you had a nice piece, if you've been to the market, you got a nice fresh piece of fish, just preparing it, getting it just seasoned properly, cooking it so that the skin is just the right level of crispness, cooking it so it's just cooked but still moist, and then doing the nice, just some very simple, appropriate vegetables, just done to the right points, and serving that at the right time in the right way, in the right surroundings, so that you and everybody you're eating those things with enjoys them at their best. That is the essence of Italian cooking, and it's the hardest thing. It's the thing that, to think, conceive and prepare and serve food in that way is so rewarding for everybody involved. And I actually, think linking it to music, I always think it's a bit like that kind of very elaborate cookery is like a complicated orchestra. Good Italian cooking is like rock and roll. You've just got, guitar, bass, drums, and a singer. Simple elements, but when they combine and the band just gets the perfect groove and a lovely rhythm, and it just grabs you deep in your chest. And that's the essence of that type of music. And it's the same with cooking, where you get that kind of visceral pleasure that's so hard to get right, but when you hit it right on the money, you just can't beat it.
That is an excellent answer. Favorite place?
I love being at home. Just invest a huge amount of effort and time into making our home a nice place. And I think, our home is very personal to us and has lots of objects and pictures and little things that represent the life we've had together. And I just like being here. But I think if I wasn't at home, probably the family, the place for us is Pembrokeshire in Wales, where it's just beautiful and unspoilt and has wonderful beaches and coastline, and we love going there with our dog, and just had lots of very free and happy times there as a family. And I'd go there tomorrow if I could, so I'd recommend it to anybody.
Excellent. And book, film, or video game?
I love reading big, heavy old novels. The Dickens and Thomas Hardy, Thackeray, those sort of big stories that have, dozens of characters, and you can really lose yourself in a whole world. But I think probably of those old novels, my all-time favorite is Don Quixote by Cervantes, the classic Spanish novel, which is just this endlessly entertaining and inventive and funny and insightful story of this very sweet-natured but deluded man who thinks himself a knight and sets off across Spain with his trusty, dim-witted but really quite wise right-hand man, Sancho Panza, and all the adventures they have. It reaches out across the centuries, really. Is written in 1600 and something, but it just is full of everyday wisdom and wit and humour and insight into human nature. Look forward to reading it. I read it probably at least 10 years ago, but it was just such a pleasure from start to finish. If I read it, if I read any book again, I would read that, but it's a 6-month job doing it.
Yeah.
But it's always become part of my inner life, really, that book. So I loved it.
Hero or person you admire?
Thinking about that, the person I've chosen is my father, just because I think we've all got people we admire, who we know about, possibly well-known people we've never met, or possibly people we've come across, but there might be something we admire about people or that we aspire to. So it was like a musical or a sporting hero or something, but you can never really know what that person is really like and what it would be like to, what a relationship would be like and what their qualities are like, what are the sacrifices they may have made to done the things that you admire. I think the difference with my father is that it's somebody that I knew very well. He died in his early 60s when I was still in my 20s, shortly after retiring. As I've mentioned earlier, he wasn't very happy in his working life, but he was just the warmest and most generous and loving father you could imagine. And he did all of that despite not being particularly happy himself. Struggled with depression and alcoholism, but he didn't make that anybody else's problem, really. And when I think about being a father myself, just a lot of the qualities of patience and kindness and good humour that he had. I would hope to have a little of that. I often think about him. He died 30 years ago, but I think about the sort of relationship we might have had, the conversations we'd have had. But yeah, he was from another time, and somebody that I love to remember. And my mother's an amazing woman as well, still with us in her 80s and deserving of a podcast of her own. Hopefully she'll be with us for many years to come, and somebody I also admire very much.
That's excellent. Well, thank you very much for your time, Ed. It's much appreciated, and I look forward to catching up with you soon. Thank you for taking the time to listen to the podcast. Until next time, remember, help people feel valued. Listen, don't just hear.